This question was great. It's specifically asking when would you use route.js instead of page.js inside of your Next.js app router application? I think my answer here is going to be both a little simpler and a little more complex than you might hope, but I think it brings a lot of value. So let's talk a bit about it quick. First, we need to know the difference between page.ts and route.ts in app router. Page.ts is how you define a page. So this is where you'd put your JSX that returns a div or whatever you want to return, export as a default function. And now whatever you return there, that is now the content of the page for that route. So if you have app/user/page.tsx, when you go to localhost 3000/user, it will resolve to this page. Route is for something entirely different, which is when you specifically want to return JSON data and have the ability to get, post, put, delete, use all the HTTP stuff that you would normally use in something like Express. Previously, the only way to do this in Next.js was through the API directory, where you could expose files with default functions exported, process request response, and it worked fine. And we used it for a lot of things. You can check out almost any of my open source projects, and I used it for some stuff. It's also how a lot of projects like TRPC would let you query things from the React client on your server just by taking one of those endpoints over and handling a bunch of requests through it. Even upload thing works this way today. If we go to the upload thing examples, and we go into pages, we'll see we have API, upload thing TS, and we're exporting the next page API handler. Since we're exporting this as the default and we're passing in the router, now whenever a request hits /API/upload thing, this is the file that processes it. And this code that we provide is the code that's run to handle that request. And this is your traditional request response. It uses the next request and next response objects. We parse the request the same way you would in Express, generate a response, and then return that response to the user. Very traditional stuff. The new route.js files are different in two ways. Or I guess there's three ways that they're different. Way one is you're not just exporting a default. You can export different functions for get, post, patch, put, delete, and all the different HTTP methods. You also aren't using Next's custom request response objects anymore. You're specifically using the built-in request response that are part of the browser. It's much more browser standards. And then here's where things get really interesting. You can put a route.ts anywhere. So you could have a page.ts file that resolves on get, and in that same route, have a route.ts file that responds on post. So now on one route, the get will send you HTML, but the post will do whatever you need to. So why would you use one over the other? Well, the whole point of this is so you can access it outside of your Next app. If you want to do things that aren't part of your render process, like you want to have a button that posts to an endpoint, you can use this. You can also use server actions when they drop, but for now you should probably use this. Or if you want your app to be accessed outside of your Next project. Why would I want my Next.js code being accessed outside of Next? Well, probably you're using something like webhooks for some part of your project, and really useful for that. If we go into the source code for the upload thing infrastructure, you'll see we have different files here in our API directory, which, to be clear, I didn't need to name it API. It just makes it easier for us to know from the URL what's being hit. And I have these different groups, which again, these parens mean that's not part of the route. It's just a way for us to group these things separately and keep track of them. In the SDK API, here are all the things that are SDK calls directly. The failure callback when a file fails to upload, poll for handling the dev mode behaviors, and prepare upload, which actually generates the URL. We also have our public API call. So these are things you can hit with traditional curl request or use our UT-API helper package to give you access to this functionality. And all of these are just route.ts files that do really basic input check, really basic response, and whatever code we need to run. Like if I look at the list files code, so here we await get file IDs and keys for app. So now we have your file IDs and keys. I also have an API wrapper that we wrote ourselves that wraps all of these functions to get your app ID, validate that your request is safe, and everything else we need to do. It's not some pattern built into Next. It's just a thing we made to solve our problems. But this lets us trivially export an async function. The request is being handled by our helper here, the API wrapper helper, but we get back app ID as well as the request, and then we do whatever we need to. Here, I'm just getting those. That's the response we get from the function. I quickly log to our analytics that this happened, and then I JSON next response that down to you. I could use the built-in browser response, but the next response class has some nice helpers, so I reach for that when I can. And it's really simple to work with. We also, as I mentioned before, have our webhook providers for things like when S3 sends us an event for a file upload being completed, or when a payment comes through via Stripe. All of these are things you would use the route for, because these are things being accessed externally, not internally. Somebody just mentioned in chat you can't do route.ts and page.ts in the same thing. That sounds likely. I just assumed you could. Slight correction to the point I made earlier. You can't have a route and a page file in the same directory. Core point still stands. The reason you reach for route.ts is you want to expose things outside of your Next app through something like a curl request or another service or an SDK that is being consumed on another device. Yeah, I don't know where miles.tsx would fit. Somebody asked, any idea why they don't mix page.ts and route.ts? I am almost certain that's because if you use a server action, the post request on the same endpoint becomes the server action handler. When you create server actions on a given route, it makes a bunch of magic, weird endpoints that expect specific things that at compiler time generate to that post request going to that thing. It works kind of similar to React hooks, how it's based on the order that the server actions are defined in. And I found a lot of bugs during the early alpha that they've, to be fair, since fixed. But yeah, it's not as easy to figure out as it might seem. Do you guys see what I do for y'all? I've been neglecting him for 5 hours. Regardless, you can still do a lot with route.ts if you want to expose things in your next app to other places. One other question I get a lot is, how do I call that route inside of the code in another page? Don't call the route, just call the code it calls. In all of our routes, you'll see most of what it's doing is making this one function call, like get file IDs and keys for app. This function is in a different file somewhere else. If we want all the file IDs and keys somewhere else, we could reuse this function on a page. I could very easily make a new page file, but let's just say I have an app ID because I haven't passed one here. So I could get it from other places, but we'll just const app ID equals fake app ID. Const data equals await. Get file IDs and keys for app ID. Now return div data.map file div key equals file.id. Not by calling the route, but by calling the same function the route calls. So I don't need to call that route in my page. I don't need to fetch to it or do some weird stuff, because then you're spinning up 2 Lambda instances for no reason. Instead, I'm just calling the same function the route calls in the page component, because both of these run on the server. And that's the magic of the new model. It's also the magic of something like tRPC. I got the question a lot, how do I use my tRPC endpoints on other things on my server? You don't. You just call the function that your tRPC functions call. If for some reason you wrote all that logic inside of here, rip it out. Like, let's say we really wanted to get this log too. I could make a separate export const do file work equals app ID string, and this is to be async, return res. And now I can call this in here, and I can import this function in the page, totally fine. Done. Now it gets logged too. So if you have functionality in your route that you want access to somewhere else, just put it in a function and call that function in both places. There's no thing that you have to know about Next for this, and that's why I like it so much. These aren't crazy patterns that you have to learn from this new framework. It's a very simple pattern, which is page.tsx if you want to return HTML, and route.ts if you want to have get, post, put, all those other HTTP things. And if you have code that you want both to run, put it in a function and call that function in both places. It's not prescribing you how to do this like other frameworks like Nest would. It's giving you the option to just make it. And I think that's awesome. In the end, there is no framework that handles composability better than your language can. And being able to write the functionality you actually need and just call it in the places that you need it, it makes life so much easier. I am genuinely really happy with these patterns, and I do like how the new route handler stuff works. Hopefully this will help you understand when to use route.ts versus page.tsx, as well as understanding a bit of the difference between how this worked in the pages router versus now with app router. This is a fun one. Appreciate y'all as always. Thank you guys again. Peace, nerds.